Welcome to another peaceful bedtime story. I'm so glad you've joined us tonight. As you settle into your cozy spot, take a deep breath and allow yourself to unwind. The gentle crackle of the fireplace will guide you into a space of calm, where the soothing words of tonight's story can bring you peace and rest. Tonight, we'll journey through the inspiring story of Joseph, a tale filled with faith, resilience, and redemption. From his dreams of greatness to the powerful lessons learned through hardship, Joseph's story reminds us that even in our darkest times, there is a greater plan unfolding. So, let go of the day's worries and allow the story to guide you towards a peaceful night's sleep. Thank you for being here, and I hope this story brings you comfort as you drift into rest. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, born to him by Rachel, the wife he loved most dearly. His birth was a moment of great joy for Jacob, and from that moment, Joseph was set apart from his brothers. Jacob's affection for Joseph was evident in the lavish gift he gave him, a richly ornamented coat, a coat of many colors. This coat became a symbol of Joseph's favored status, a constant reminder to his brothers of how deeply Jacob loved him. As the youngest son, Joseph's position in the family only served to deepen the resentment his older brothers already felt. They had grown accustomed to being the ones who worked the hardest, while Joseph seemed to enjoy the privileges of being the youngest. But it wasn't just his father's love and the coat that made Joseph stand out. It was his dreams. Joseph had a series of dreams that seemed to suggest he would one day rise above his family. In the first, he and his brothers were in the field binding sheaves of grain. His sheaf stood upright, while all the others gathered around and bowed to his. When he shared this dream with his brothers, their jealousy flared. "Will you reign over us?" they mocked, their anger rising with every word. In another dream, Joseph saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. This time, even Jacob, though initially scolding him for speaking such things, could not ignore the profound nature of the dream. "What is this dream you had?" Jacob asked. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Jacob, though perplexed, kept the dream in his heart, wondering about its true meaning. But as for Joseph's brothers, their hatred only grew. They saw these dreams as a reminder of Joseph's superiority, and their resentment deepened. The dreams Joseph shared were not just fanciful imaginings. They were divine messages that would soon set into motion a remarkable chain of events. What seemed to be arrogant boasting from Joseph's perspective was actually a glimpse of God's plan, a plan that would unfold through hardship and triumph. But Joseph's brothers, driven by their jealousy, could not see what was to come. Instead, their growing hatred would lead to a decision that would change their lives and Joseph's forever. The resentment between Joseph and his brothers had been simmering for years, and now it was on the verge of boiling over. Every glance Joseph received from his brothers seemed to carry an unspoken message, one of bitterness, frustration, and anger. The once peaceful family dynamic had turned sour, and Joseph, with his brightly colored coat and dreams of ruling over his family, had unknowingly become the center of a storm. To them, Joseph was the embodiment of everything they lacked: love from their father, favor, and the promise of a future they could never attain. Their jealousy was palpable as they watched him from a distance, his coat shining brightly in the sun, a symbol of their father's special love for him. It wasn't just the coat that irked them. It was the arrogance they perceived in his every step, his every word. His dreams of being exalted while they bowed down were like salt in an open wound. The more Joseph spoke of them, the deeper the divide grew between him and his brothers. On that fateful day, when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers in the distant fields, the tension among the family members reached its breaking point. The brothers had been out in the sun for hours, tending to the flocks, their faces weathered and rough from the labor. They were used to working under the hot, relentless sun, and the dusty air around them was thick with exhaustion. The hills in the distance were bathed in a golden light, and the ground beneath their feet felt hard and unforgiving. They hadn't seen their younger brother for some time, but when they spotted him in the distance, a figure walking toward them with a purposeful gait, their anger flared once again. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them sneered, the words filled with venom. They could see the coat long before Joseph came into view, its bright colors a glaring contrast to the barren, sun-baked landscape. It was a symbol of Joseph's pride, and it fueled the flames of their resentment. They didn't need to see his face. The sight of the coat alone was enough to ignite their fury. As Joseph neared them, unaware of the malicious thoughts running through their minds, the brothers huddled together, whispering in low, angry voices. The air around them seemed to thicken, as if even nature could sense the impending violence. One by one, they spoke of their hatred for Joseph, and their plan began to take shape, a plan that would rid them of their brother once and for all. At first, the idea of murder seemed to hold sway. Their hearts were hardened with anger, and the thought of ending Joseph's life seemed like the only way to finally silence him, to end the torment his very presence caused. "Let's kill him," one brother said coldly, the suggestion hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. "We'll tell our father that a wild animal attacked him." But Reuben, the eldest, his face drawn and tired from years of managing the family's many conflicts, hesitated. His sense of morality, though dimmed by years of frustration, still held some sway over him. "Let's not take his life," he urged, his voice softer than the others. "Instead, throw him into this cistern here. It's dry and deep, and no one will find him." His plan was to return later, when the others had gone, and rescue Joseph. But for now, they could imprison him, and Reuben could buy enough time to figure out what to do next. The brothers reluctantly agreed, though they did so with little compassion. They pulled Joseph aside, and the sight of him, his face innocent and unaware of their malicious intentions, only made their anger burn brighter. The brothers grabbed him roughly, tearing the colorful coat from his shoulders. As they stripped him of his garment, they felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. This coat, the very symbol of his favored status, would soon be stained with the dust and dirt of their cruelty. They threw Joseph into the deep cistern, the darkness swallowing him as he hit the cold stone at the bottom. The pit was dry, but the air inside was heavy and suffocating, and Joseph could feel his heart race with a mix of fear and confusion. He cried out, but his voice was lost in the emptiness of the cistern. He had no idea why his brothers were doing this, why they were turning against him. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but he was trapped completely at their mercy. As the brothers sat down to eat, the contrast between their casual meal and the dire situation unfolding was stark. The food they ate seemed tasteless, as if even the simple act of eating could not lift their spirits. They ate in silence, each one lost in their thoughts, unaware of the weight of what they had just done. But as they finished their meal, their eyes were drawn to a distant caravan. It was a group of merchants from Gilead, traveling to Egypt with their goods. The sight of them sparked a change in Judah's mind. "Why should we kill him and cover up his blood?" Judah asked, his voice thoughtful but cold. "Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites instead." His suggestion hung in the air, and the brothers, though reluctant, agreed. It was a chance to get rid of Joseph without bloodshed, and they could still make money from the deal. With no hesitation, they pulled Joseph from the cistern, his limbs weak from the cold, and bound him, ready to sell him into slavery. For 20 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, Joseph was sold to the merchants. His life was no longer his own, and his dreams of greatness seemed distant and unattainable. The brothers, feeling a strange mixture of relief and triumph, watched as the caravan took Joseph away. His cries faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast desert. That evening, they returned to their father. They dipped Joseph's coat in goat's blood, staining it in a way that would make it look as though Joseph had been torn apart by wild animals. When Jacob saw the coat, his heart sank. The unmistakable bloodstains confirmed his worst fear. His beloved son was gone. Devastated, Jacob tore his clothes and mourned deeply for Joseph, refusing to be comforted. His grief was like a shadow that clung to him unrelenting and deep. He would not be consoled, for he believed his son had been lost forever. As Joseph was led away by the merchants, the world he knew began to slip away from him. He could hardly comprehend the enormity of what was happening. Just hours before, he had been living a life of relative comfort, adored by his father and dreaming of a future filled with purpose. But now, his hands bound and his heart heavy with confusion, Joseph was thrust into a world of uncertainty. The caravan of merchants moved swiftly through the arid wilderness, the heat of the desert sun beating down relentlessly on Joseph's back. The vast, endless horizon stretched out before him, offering no sign of hope or escape. The merchants spoke little to him, and even when they did, it was in a language that felt foreign and distant. Joseph, though intelligent, could not fully understand them, and he felt completely isolated, a stranger in a land he had never known. The journey was long and grueling. The ground beneath their feet was rocky and uneven, and the caravan often stopped to rest by meager wells where the merchants would refill their water skins. Joseph's legs were sore from the long walks, and the dust that clung to his skin felt like an unrelenting reminder of his new reality. His once immaculate coat was now torn and dirtied, a far cry from the symbol of his father's favor it had once been. At night, the stars seemed to taunt him as he lay on the hard ground. The beauty of the desert sky was lost on him. He was too consumed with thoughts of his family, wondering what they were doing and if they even missed him. Had they truly betrayed him? Was this his fate? To be lost in a foreign land, far from the only home he had ever known? The nights were the hardest. The cold desert air wrapped around him like a blanket, but it offered no comfort. Alone in the darkness, Joseph could hear the sounds of the desert, faint winds rustling the sand, the distant cries of nocturnal creatures. But the silence in his heart was deafening. His brothers' faces haunted him in the darkness, and he could feel their anger and betrayal as if it were still alive in his chest. Days turned into weeks, and Joseph grew weaker from the physical toll of the journey, but it was the emotional weight that wore on him the most. The fear of the unknown gnawed at his thoughts, and he found himself questioning everything he had believed. Was this truly God's plan for him? How could a future of greatness, a future of ruling over his brothers, come from such misery and hardship? It wasn't until they reached the city of Egypt that Joseph was able to see the world in a new light. The bustling streets were unlike anything he had ever known. The sights, sounds, and smells overwhelmed his senses. People moved in every direction, some shouting in the crowded marketplace, others haggling for goods, while the aroma of spices and fresh bread filled the air. Joseph, wide-eyed and overwhelmed, could hardly take it all in. He had been thrust into a new world, a world of complexity, power, and grandeur, but it was also a world full of danger and uncertainty. The merchants led Joseph through the city, their movements confident and purposeful as they navigated through the narrow streets. The architecture was unlike anything Joseph had ever seen. Tall stone buildings, adorned with hieroglyphs and images of gods, towered above him. It was a city of ancient power, and Joseph, a mere boy, was about to become a part of it, though he did not yet understand what role he would play. As they entered the slave market, Joseph's heart pounded in his chest. The marketplace was filled with people from all walks of life, buyers, sellers, and onlookers, all jostling and shouting as they bargained over goods and people. The atmosphere was charged with an unsettling energy, and Joseph couldn't help but feel like a mere commodity, stripped of his identity and worth. A man approached the merchants, his eyes scanning the crowd, his posture commanding. He was a powerful Egyptian official, a man of high rank named Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Potiphar had come to the slave market looking for someone to serve in his household. And when his eyes fell upon Joseph, he saw something in the young man, a strength, a resilience that others might have overlooked. Potiphar's gaze lingered on Joseph, and for a moment Joseph wondered if he was about to be bought and sold once again. But to his surprise, Potiphar stepped forward and negotiated the price for Joseph's release. The exchange was swift, and before Joseph could fully process what had happened, he found himself in the service of Potiphar, a man who would change the course of his life forever. Joseph's new life in Egypt was vastly different from anything he had known. Gone were the rolling hills of Canaan, replaced by the opulent splendor of Potiphar's estate. The household was grand, with beautiful gardens and towering stone walls that shielded it from the bustling city outside. Joseph was introduced to a life of luxury, a far cry from the desolate desert journey he had endured. Yet, amid all the grandeur, he still felt the ache of separation from his family, from his homeland. Potiphar, recognizing Joseph's sharp mind and keen sense of responsibility, quickly entrusted him with many duties. Joseph was put in charge of managing Potiphar's entire household, overseeing servants, ensuring the smooth running of the estate, and handling all of Potiphar's business affairs. Joseph's talents did not go unnoticed. His natural charisma and diligent work ethic earned him the respect of those around him, and his status within the household continued to rise. Potiphar, in particular, grew fond of Joseph, and he trusted him completely, giving him authority over everything in his home. The estate became a place where Joseph's integrity and character were tested daily. With each passing day, Joseph grew stronger, more confident in his abilities. He found peace in his work, using it to distract himself from the pain of his past. The rhythmic duties of the household, the steady progress of the estate's operations provided him with a sense of purpose. But despite his success, there was a shadow looming over him, one that he could not easily escape. Potiphar's wife, a woman of beauty and charm, took notice of Joseph as well. Her eyes followed him as he moved through the house, and before long she began to make advances toward him. At first, Joseph dismissed her behavior, knowing that it was wrong, but the pressure grew. She was relentless in her pursuit, offering him everything he could ever want: wealth, status, and favor in Potiphar's eyes. But Joseph knew that the consequences of yielding to her would be dire. He resisted her advances with great care, but she was determined. Day after day, she would approach him with flattering words, trying to coax him into compromising his integrity. Joseph, however, remained firm, reminding himself of his father's teachings and the God he trusted. But Potiphar's wife was not one to be easily dismissed. She grew frustrated by Joseph's rejection, and one day, when the house was quiet, she made a bold move. Alone in the house, she seized the opportunity and grabbed hold of Joseph's cloak. She demanded that he lay with her, but Joseph, sensing the danger, fled from her grasp, leaving his cloak behind. In that moment, his escape was a testament to his character. He was willing to sacrifice his honor rather than succumb to temptation. But Potiphar's wife was not finished. Angered by his rejection, she devised a cruel plan to ruin his reputation. When Potiphar returned home, his wife immediately accused Joseph of attempting to assault her, showing him the cloak she had taken as evidence of his supposed crime. Potiphar, devastated by the accusation and believing his wife, had no choice but to have Joseph thrown into prison. It was a harsh punishment for someone who had served Potiphar with such loyalty, but in the world Joseph now found himself. Innocence was often disregarded when power and reputation were at stake. Joseph's heart sank as he was led away to the dark, damp prison. The walls were cold, the air heavy with despair. It seemed that once again he was being cast aside, abandoned to a fate he did not deserve. Yet, even in this bleak moment, Joseph's faith did not falter. He had been betrayed, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. But he still held on to the belief that God had a purpose for his life. The prison was a place of unimaginable hardship. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and musty earth. The sound of chains rattling echoed through the halls, and the prisoners moved about in silence, their faces worn by time and suffering. But despite the grimness of his surroundings, Joseph did not allow the bitterness of his circumstances to consume him. He kept his head high, his spirit unbroken, and he continued to serve others, offering help and comfort to his fellow prisoners. It wasn't long before Joseph's kindness and strength began to attract the attention of the prison guards. His ability to organize and care for the other prisoners made him an invaluable asset, and soon Joseph was given a position of authority within the prison. He had once again risen to a place of respect, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. It was clear that God's hand was upon him, guiding him through each trial and tribulation. Joseph's life in prison was far from easy, but his resilience and faith continued to guide him. The days in the dark, damp cells seemed to stretch on forever, yet Joseph refused to let despair take root in his heart. He found solace in his quiet moments of prayer and in the acts of kindness he offered to the fellow prisoners. Despite the harshness of his circumstances, Joseph believed that God had a plan for him, one that would eventually lead to a greater purpose. His time in the prison was not spent idly. Joseph was quick to recognize the needs of the other prisoners, and he used his position of authority to help them in any way he could. His wisdom and leadership skills shone through as he managed the daily routines of the prison, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. He offered comfort and encouragement to those around him, his kindness standing in stark contrast to the grimness of their surroundings. One day, 2 new prisoners were brought into the jail, Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker. Both had fallen out of favor with Pharaoh and were now serving time for offenses they had committed. Joseph noticed them immediately, sensing that there was something special about these men. They carried with them an air of unease, as though something weighed heavily on their hearts. Joseph approached them and asked, "Why are your faces so sad today?" He could see the worry in their eyes, and his compassion moved him to offer his assistance. The cupbearer and baker explained that they had both had troubling dreams the night before, dreams that they could not understand. They were desperate for an interpretation, as the dreams seemed to hold some significance, but they had no one to turn to for answers. Joseph, ever humble and guided by his faith, replied, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams, and I will try to interpret them." The cupbearer spoke first, recounting his dream. He had seen a vine with 3 branches that blossomed and produced grapes. He squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph listened intently and then offered the interpretation. "The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position as cupbearer. But when you are restored, remember me and speak to Pharaoh on my behalf, for I was unjustly thrown into this prison." The cupbearer's face lit up with relief. The interpretation was exactly what he had hoped for. He thanked Joseph profusely and promised to remember him when he returned to Pharaoh's court. Next, the baker told his dream. In his dream, he had seen 3 baskets of bread on his head, and birds came and ate the bread from the top basket. Joseph's expression grew somber as he listened. "This is what the dream means," he said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head as well, but for a very different reason. You will be hanged, and the birds will eat your flesh." The baker's face fell at Joseph's interpretation, but he had no choice but to accept the truth. Joseph's words, though difficult to hear, were clear, and the baker left the prison with a heavy heart. 3 days later, Joseph's interpretations came true. Pharaoh's cupbearer was restored to his position, and the baker was executed. As the cupbearer was led out of the prison to return to Pharaoh's court, he promised to remember Joseph and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. But once he was free, he forgot about Joseph, his promise lost in the bustle of his newfound freedom. Joseph was left in the prison, still waiting for his moment. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next, and Joseph could not help but wonder when, if, his time would come. But even in the quiet of the prison, Joseph trusted that God's plan was still unfolding. His faith remained strong, and he held on to the hope that one day he would be set free. Time passed, and Joseph's life in prison became a distant memory as the years slipped away. Despite his unfulfilled promises and the loneliness that accompanied his confinement, Joseph never lost hope. He continued to trust that God had a purpose for his life, even though it seemed as if his dreams of freedom and restoration would never come to pass. One day, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, had a troubling dream. It was unlike any dream he had ever had before. In the first dream, Pharaoh saw 7 fat, healthy cows grazing by the Nile River, but suddenly 7 thin, gaunt cows appeared and ate the fat cows, leaving Pharaoh puzzled and disturbed. He awoke, but the dream did not leave him. He fell back to sleep, only to dream another strange vision. 7 healthy ears of grain grew on one stalk, but 7 thin, withered ears of grain devoured the healthy ones. Pharaoh's heart raced. He called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt to come before him, hoping that one of them could offer an interpretation. But none could explain the meaning of the dreams. The ruler of the greatest nation in the world was left without answers, his mind clouded by fear and uncertainty. What did these dreams mean? Why were they so vivid, so urgent? Pharaoh's frustration grew as he sought anyone who could bring clarity. It was then that the cupbearer, who had been restored to his position, suddenly remembered Joseph. He had promised to speak on Joseph's behalf, but in the hustle of his return to Pharaoh's court, he had forgotten about the man who had helped him in prison. Now, as Pharaoh struggled with his dreams, the cupbearer's memory was jogged. "I know a man," the cupbearer said. "There is a Hebrew in prison who interpreted my dream. He spoke with the wisdom of God, and his interpretation came true." Pharaoh's ears perked up at this mention of someone who could interpret dreams. He immediately ordered for Joseph to be brought before him. Joseph, still wearing the simple clothes of a prisoner, was quickly washed and dressed in fine garments, his unkempt hair and face cleaned in preparation to stand before the most powerful man in Egypt. He was summoned to the palace, his heart filled with anticipation. When Joseph entered Pharaoh's presence, he stood tall, his posture calm, yet dignified. Pharaoh's eyes studied him intently, sensing that this man held something special. Joseph did not immediately speak, but waited patiently as Pharaoh recounted the troubling dreams. Pharaoh looked to Joseph and said, "I have heard it said that you can interpret dreams. Is it true?" Joseph's response was both humble and bold. "I cannot do it," he said, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This simple declaration was a testament to Joseph's unwavering faith. He could have taken credit for his ability, but instead he pointed to God as the true source of wisdom and understanding. It was in that moment that Pharaoh's eyes were opened, and he recognized that Joseph was not just any ordinary man. Joseph listened intently as Pharaoh recounted both dreams, and then, with a steady voice, he began to speak. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy ears of grain represent 7 years of abundance, a time when Egypt will experience prosperity and plenty. But the 7 thin cows and the 7 withered ears of grain represent 7 years of famine, a time when there will be no food to sustain the people." Joseph paused, allowing Pharaoh to absorb the weight of the interpretation. "The famine will be so severe," Joseph continued, that it will erase all memory of the years of abundance. The famine will devour everything, and Egypt will be left in ruin. Joseph's heart was heavy with the weight of the prophecy, but he continued with wisdom beyond his years. Pharaoh should choose a wise and discerning man to oversee the land of Egypt, someone who will gather the surplus of grain during the 7 years of abundance and store it for the years of famine. In this way, Egypt will be prepared when the famine comes, and the people will be saved. Pharaoh listened in awe as Joseph spoke, his words carrying the weight of divine revelation. He could see the wisdom in Joseph's interpretation, and he recognized the clarity and authority in his counsel. There was no doubt in Pharaoh's mind that Joseph had been chosen by God for a purpose far greater than anything he had imagined. After a long pause, Pharaoh turned to his advisors and said, "Can we find anyone else like this man? One in whom is the Spirit of God?" It was a question that required no answer. Pharaoh knew, as did everyone in the room, that Joseph was the only one who could lead Egypt through the coming crisis. Pharaoh, overwhelmed by Joseph's wisdom and clear insight, wasted no time in taking action. He turned to his officials and declared, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." With those words, Joseph's life was changed forever. In an instant, he went from being a prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt. He was given the royal signet ring, a symbol of his authority, and clothed in fine linen, his appearance transformed to reflect his newfound position. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was given a chariot to ride in, a procession that symbolized his status. Wherever Joseph went, people bowed down before him, paying homage to the man who had saved Egypt from the impending famine. Pharaoh's words echoed in Joseph's mind as he stood in the grand palace. His heart swelled with gratitude, but also with awe at the way God had orchestrated every step of his journey. It had been a long road, full of pain, betrayal, and hardship. But now, Joseph saw how each moment had led to this extraordinary moment of elevation. God had never abandoned him, even in the darkest hours of his life. God had been preparing him for this day. As part of his new responsibilities, Joseph was tasked with overseeing the storage of grain during the 7 years of abundance. The entire land of Egypt was to gather the surplus and store it in cities across the kingdom. Joseph, with his keen insight and organizational skills, directed the collection and distribution of grain, ensuring that Egypt would have enough to survive the coming famine. He spared no effort, making sure that every grain was counted, every storehouse was filled to the brim, and that no resource was wasted. During these years of plenty, Joseph's influence spread throughout the land. He was known for his fair and just dealings, and his leadership was marked by an unshakable commitment to God's guidance. The people of Egypt began to trust him, knowing that he would lead them with wisdom and integrity. Joseph's actions in those years of abundance were not just about storing food for the future. They were about building trust and establishing a legacy that would endure for generations. As the years of plenty passed, the famine that Joseph had foretold began to take shape. The skies grew dry, the crops failed, and the rivers that once brought life to the land began to dry up. The first signs of hunger appeared, and the people of Egypt began to feel the weight of the coming crisis. The famine was no longer a distant worry. It had arrived. The people of Egypt, once thriving in abundance, found themselves standing in long lines outside the storehouses that Joseph had overseen. They had no choice but to wait patiently, hoping for a glimpse of the food they so desperately needed. Joseph, ever the calm and wise leader, continued to manage the grain distribution with care, ensuring that no one went without. The famine spread, and soon it reached beyond the borders of Egypt, affecting the surrounding nations as well. In the midst of this crisis, Joseph's family in Canaan was also suffering. Jacob, Joseph's father, heard that there was grain in Egypt, and he sent his sons to buy food. Little did they know that the brother they had betrayed so many years ago was now the one who held the keys to their survival. As the brothers approached Egypt, they were unaware that the man they would meet in the palace was none other than Joseph. He recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. They had changed over the years, and the pain of their past was still buried deep in Joseph's heart. He stood before them, now a man of power and wisdom, and watched as they bowed down before him, fulfilling the very dream he had shared with them all those years ago. As Joseph stood in the grand hall of the palace, his mind raced. His brothers, his flesh and blood, were now standing before him, bowing down as he had seen in his dreams all those years ago. But Joseph was not the young, naive boy they had once known. He was a powerful man, now cloaked in the riches and authority of Pharaoh's court. His heart was heavy with mixed emotions, anger, betrayal, but also a deep yearning for reconciliation. The brothers, unaware of the identity of the man before them, bowed low in humility, just as Joseph's dreams had foretold. They had traveled a long distance from their home in Canaan to purchase grain, driven by the desperate need to feed their families in the midst of the famine that had gripped the land. They were unaware that their brother, whom they had sold into slavery, was now the very one who held their fate in his hands. Joseph studied them carefully, his gaze steady and unwavering. He saw the faces of the men who had once been his tormentors, but time had changed them. Their eyes were weary, their faces lined with the burdens of years filled with hardship. They had aged, as had he, and in that moment, Joseph felt a strange mix of compassion and sorrow for them. He spoke to them in a language they did not understand, using an interpreter to communicate his thoughts. "You are spies," Joseph accused, his voice firm and authoritative. "You have come to see the weakness of the land." The brothers, caught off guard by this accusation, quickly denied it. "No, my lord, we are your servants. We have come only to buy food for our families. We are the sons of one man, and we are 12 in total. The youngest is with our father, and one is no more." Joseph's heart tightened at the mention of his father, Jacob, but he did not reveal his identity. Instead, he pressed on with his questioning. "If you are truly honest men, prove it. One of you must stay here, and the rest of you will return to your land to bring back your youngest brother. Only then will I believe you." The brothers were taken aback. They had no idea who this man was or why he was asking them to bring their youngest brother, but they were desperate, and they had no choice but to comply. After all, they needed the grain to survive, and this man, who had the power to offer them help, was not someone they could afford to anger. Joseph watched them carefully as they deliberated. He could see the fear in their eyes, the weight of their past sins hanging over them. He had not yet revealed his true identity, and he was not sure how to proceed. But he knew that he needed to test them, to see if they had truly changed or if they were still the same men who had betrayed him all those years ago. After a tense pause, Joseph decided to take another step. He ordered his servants to fill their sacks with grain, but to also place each brother's money back into his sack. He wanted to see how they would react when they discovered the money had been returned to them. Would they take it as an opportunity to deceive him, or would they be honest about what had happened? As the brothers left Egypt, the weight of their journey ahead of them hung heavy in the air. They had no idea what Joseph had planned, but they had obeyed his orders. Little did they know the path that lay before them would lead to a deeper understanding of their past and the possibility of a reunion with their estranged brother. The brothers traveled back to Canaan, and as they opened their sacks to distribute the grain among their families, they made a startling discovery. The money they had paid for the grain was lying at the top of each of their sacks. Panic immediately set in. "What is this that God has done to us?" they cried in fear. They feared that they would be accused of theft and that their lives were now in danger. They returned to their father Jacob and recounted everything that had happened in Egypt. They told him about the man who had accused them of being spies, their journey to bring Benjamin back, and the mysterious return of their money. Jacob was filled with grief and anger, convinced that God was punishing them for the sins they had committed against Joseph. The brothers felt the weight of their past actions pressing down on them, and they knew that they would have to return to Egypt to face the consequences. But they were not the same men they had been when they had sold Joseph into slavery. Time and hardship had changed them, and the guilt they carried for their betrayal was now a heavy burden on their hearts. Joseph, for all his power and authority, still held the key to their future, and they knew that they would need his forgiveness if they were to find peace. The days had passed since the brothers' first encounter with the powerful Egyptian official. Their grain supply had dwindled, and the reality of the famine that gripped the land became harder to ignore. Jacob, the father, knew that they had no choice but to return to Egypt for more food. But this time, there was one crucial difference. They must bring their youngest brother Benjamin with them. The thought of losing Benjamin, the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, filled Jacob with dread. But hunger prevailed, and the journey had to be made. As the brothers prepared for the long journey, the weight of their past actions lingered like a shadow. They could not forget the cruel way they had treated Joseph years earlier. And now, as they faced the prospect of returning to the very man who had accused them of spying, there was a deep sense of guilt and fear in their hearts. What would Joseph think of them? Would he remember their betrayal? Would he show mercy, or would he punish them for the sins they had committed? Benjamin, too, felt a sense of unease. The journey to Egypt would take him into unknown lands where he would meet a man of great power, someone whose fate was tied to the story of his family's darkest hour. He was the youngest, the one who had been spared the same cruel treatment his older brothers had inflicted on Joseph. Yet there was no escaping the legacy of betrayal that hung over their family. Every step of the journey felt heavier than the last, and the anticipation of what awaited them in Egypt grew with each passing mile. Finally, after days of travel, they arrived in Egypt once again. The marketplace was bustling with activity. Traders from all corners of the world came to buy and sell goods. As they made their way to the palace, the brothers were filled with both awe and apprehension. The official they had dealt with before was now waiting for them, and they knew that their fate was in his hands. What would he do with them? Would he treat them as spies again, or would he show mercy? As they approached the grand hall, the brothers exchanged nervous glances. Their hearts raced, and their thoughts were filled with the memories of the past. They had betrayed their brother, and now they feared they might face the consequences of their actions. Their once proud and confident demeanor had been replaced with a humility born from their guilt. But as they entered the presence of the official, they were met with something unexpected. The man before them did not seem angry or vengeful. Instead, he greeted them with a calm, measured tone, and for a moment they could almost forget the tension that had built up in their hearts. There was something in his eyes, something familiar yet unrecognizable. Was it possible? Could this be the brother they had sold into slavery, the one they had abandoned to an uncertain fate? Joseph had seen his brothers many times before, but he had yet to reveal himself to them. He had tested their hearts, watched their reactions, and listened carefully to their words. And now, the moment had arrived. The brothers had returned just as he had known they would. But this time, it would be different. This time, they would face the truth, and Joseph would be the one to bring that truth to light. The stage was set for the moment when everything would change. The air in the grand hall was thick with tension as the brothers stood before the powerful Egyptian official, waiting for what seemed like an eternity. Joseph had not yet revealed his true identity, and his brothers were still unaware that they were standing before the very man they had wronged all those years ago. But deep within, Joseph knew that the time had come. The moment for testing and waiting was over. It was time for truth to be revealed. Joseph looked at his brothers, his heart heavy with the memories of their betrayal. His once youthful dreams of greatness had led him down a path of unimaginable trials and suffering. But through it all, he had never lost faith. Now, standing before the men who had torn his life apart, he felt an overwhelming sense of both sadness and relief. The past, with all its pain, was about to collide with the present, and nothing would ever be the same again. "Joseph," the man said, his voice firm but calm, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into slavery." The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing through the chamber like a clap of thunder. The brothers froze, their minds struggling to comprehend the truth that had just been laid bare before them. Their eyes widened in disbelief, their breaths catching in their throats. The man standing before them, this powerful Egyptian official, this ruler of the land, was their brother Joseph, the one they had betrayed so long ago. For a moment, no one spoke. The brothers stood frozen, staring at Joseph in shock. Their guilt, which had haunted them for years, now surged to the surface, and they were filled with fear and shame. How could they face the man they had wronged so deeply? What would he do to them now that the truth had been revealed? But Joseph's eyes softened, and his voice broke the silence. "Do not be afraid," he said gently. "I am not angry with you. What you intended for harm, God intended for good. He sent me ahead of you to save lives, to preserve a remnant on the earth, and to keep many people alive. Tears welled up in Joseph's eyes as he spoke these words, his heart full of compassion for the brothers who had once betrayed him. He understood now, more than ever, that the pain he had endured had led to something far greater. His suffering had not been in vain. It had been part of a divine plan, a plan that had brought him to this moment of reconciliation. The brothers, overwhelmed by Joseph's words, fell to their knees in awe and sorrow. They wept openly, their emotions flooding to the surface as the weight of their past actions crushed them. They had feared for so long that their sins would catch up with them, that the truth would come to light and bring judgment upon them. But in that moment, they found not judgment, but forgiveness. Joseph reached out and embraced each of his brothers one by one, lifting them from the floor. His heart overflowed with love and mercy, and he whispered words of comfort to them. "It is not too late," he said. "God has brought us together. We are family, and nothing will ever change that." The brothers wept with joy. The burden of guilt that had weighed so heavily on them for years now lifted from their shoulders. They understood the depth of Joseph's forgiveness, and they knew that their relationship with him had been restored. In that moment, the past was no longer a chain that bound them, but a testament to the power of grace and the healing of broken relationships. Joseph invited his brothers to stay with him in Egypt, to bring their father Jacob and their families, and to live in the land where he had risen to such power. And so, the family was reunited, not in anger or resentment, but in love and reconciliation. The pain of the past had been transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the unbreakable bonds of family. As we come to the close of Joseph's powerful story, we reflect on the incredible journey of faith, patience, and forgiveness. From the betrayal of his brothers to his rise in Egypt, Joseph's life is a testament to trusting in God's plan, even when it seems uncertain. His willingness to forgive those who wronged him shows us the strength and grace that comes from trusting in the bigger picture, knowing that sometimes, through our struggles, we are made stronger. In the quiet of the evening, as you rest and reflect on the story of Joseph, may you be reminded of the peace that comes from letting go of past hurts and embracing the hope of reconciliation. May his journey inspire you to forgive, to trust, and to believe that everything is part of a greater plan, even when the path seems unclear. We thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope this story has brought you comfort and peace, and that as you settle down to sleep, you can feel the gentle rhythm of faith in your heart. Remember, no matter where you are on your own journey, you are not alone. There is always hope and always room for grace. We'd love to hear from you. What's your favorite Bible story? Or is there a specific tale you'd like to hear next? Leave a comment below and let us know. We always enjoy connecting with our wonderful community. Don't forget to subscribe for more peaceful bedtime Bible stories to help you wind down and find rest after a long day. Take a deep breath now, close your eyes, and drift off into a peaceful sleep, knowing that you are cherished and loved. We look forward to sharing more stories with you again soon. Good night, and God bless.